I'm Adriana de Souza Silva, and I'm a communication studies professor at Northeastern University and also the director of the Center for Transformative Media. So the idea of mobile network creativity actually comes from my previous research on the social uses of cell phones and mobile technologies, and especially within low-income and marginalized communities. For the previous decade, I have been doing interviews and focus groups with people who lived in slums or favelas in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and specifically looking at the ways that they use technology for social purposes and in community building, sometimes in ways that were not envisioned or foreseeable by the designers of technology. And there's a lot of literature on that from other mobile communication scholars. So for example, practices of beeping, where people didn't have enough cell phone credits and they would, instead of calling somebody because they would not be able to call, they would have a pre-arrangement where people would call them back and let the cell phone ring twice to indicate, for example, pick up my son at school, or sharing a cell phone among a family in situations where, a cell phone is normally understood as a personal communication device. And there are also some subversive uses of what people call subversive uses of phones, where, like, for example, drug dealers who are in prison would kind of smuggle cell phones in to be able to talk and coordinate traffic from prison, and also sometimes have deals with people in cell phone companies that would allow them to call anywhere else in the world for free. That was called the diretão, which is like a direct, straight call. So there were a lot of these practices that sometimes were considered appropriation and subversive that I was working on. Suddenly I was in conversations with May, who was working with me at that time in my office, and she had a whole line of research on migrants and refugees, forced migrants and refugees, who also had very interesting practices with mobile technologies and network technologies that would allow them to survive the journey, and sometimes like unexpected practices. And then we are kind of talking that sometimes these practices, they were actually very creative, but nowhere we had seen people or scholars talking about as creative practices. They would normally be talked about as appropriation or subversion, and sometimes with a negative connotation, not always. But we were thinking like, wow, creativity is such a hot topic nowadays. Everybody talks about, how to be more creative, but not normally related to high arts, right? And like painting or using computers, design, but not among people who actually are marginalized and don't have access to the proper technologies or to the proper ways of using technologies. So we went ahead and started thinking about what creativity is and how creativity is normally defined. May actually did an extensive lit review in the field of what it's called creativity studies and the ontology of creativity. And one of the things we found out is that normally creativity was, for the most part and to the common public, normally defined as an individual activity and something that people achieve with intense concentration and contemplation. We have classic depictions of that as the idea of like Newton looking at an apple fall to figure out the theory of gravity, or Archimedes in the bathtub and saying Eureka, or even Rodin's depiction of the thinker. Of a thinker is a person who is by themselves, alone, and therefore that can be creative. On the other hand, a lot of times creativity is associated to artistic practices. So for example, somebody that, you're painting, a painter can be creative, or a writer. In fact, creativity was first used in that context to describe the works of Shakespeare. So in all these activities, they were related to not only people who were working by themselves, but also people who had the resources and the time to be creative. So we were thinking, well, in our research, or what we are looking at these practices, there's none of that, right? People were, first of all, they were working collectively. There were groups of forced migrants, or people were sharing phones in the favelas. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the training or the practice to be creative. And in most parts, creativity was, in that sense, was not kind of a pre-planned practice. For example, when you design an object, for example, that you plan, or design a game or paint something, it was pretty much an emerging practice that was ongoing and sometimes serendipitous. So we started thinking of how to redefine creativity to also include these practices as creative, but really redefining and reconceptualizing it as basically a network that emerges from the relationships between the people, the technologies, and the spaces or the context where they are. And so all of these things working together kind of leads to creative practices. And also, most importantly to us, is the idea of mobility or immobility. So as a catalyst for these creative practices. So either you were forced, like the power relationships that come with either being forced to move or being prevented from move, and the lack of resources that kind of sparks the creative potential. And lastly, we are trying to understand creativity not just as a practice that leads to the construction of something, but basically a process in itself. So it doesn't necessarily have an outcome, but it's a practice that occurs that create communities among these people. So the primary methods we're using is basically a case study basis. We figure out that we are, well, mostly, first of all, a critical interpretive analysis, that we are trying to define a concept, like what is this idea of creativity and how it differs from traditional ways that we have normally understood what creative practices are. And then we're kind of basically collecting case studies from around the world, creative practices, to kind of ground and exemplify how this kind of creativity can unfold. And there are many, many ways this can be done. I'm just going to give one example that I really like. So in Brazil, and there is this neighborhood, or this kind of city called Queimados, which is about 50 kilometers from Rio, and was considered for many years in a row one of the most violent places in Brazil. One of the reasons for why that happened is that Queimados was already a very poor community, but with the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympic Games in 2016, a lot of low-income communities, especially people who lived in favelas, they were displaced from Rio to kind of make room for the games, and they were sent to Queimados. So what happened is that a city that already had no infrastructure and no resources got an influx of people. So the issues with unemployment increased. There were, drug dealers took over the city. So a lot of kids started working for the drug dealers. They started having problems with transportation. There was not enough transportation. They couldn't get anywhere. And that was when this guy called Carlos Greenbike, he was a really advocate for, bikes as a means of transportation, and he kind of collectively gathered the community so that they were retrieving abandoned bikes from the city of Rio, refurbishing them to give to the people, and in addition to that, they started building their own bikes made out of bamboo, and therefore they created a fleet of bikes that they started using WhatsApp, which is a tool that everybody uses, to rent those bikes. So they basically creating a bike rental service that's not, apart from like this traditional proprietary apps where you kind of have to have like a high-end cell phone, a bank account, and rent things like the Blue Bikes in Boston, for example. They kind of created their own bikes and created their bike renting system. And that actually solved the community problem where basically the kids who were previously working for the drug dealers, they started working with refurbishing bikes, and other people also got jobs, and also solve the transportation problem, mobility problem in that community through a practice that was clearly creative and developed without like basically no resources, and just the way that the circumstances led to the community to organize themselves. So one of the things that we hope is that this idea of mobile network creativity is not just a concept or a way to understand creativity, but it actually can have real impact on lots of industries and scholarly areas of how people understand creativity. So for example, that can change the way technology designers or policymakers understand our relationship with technology. So instead of like a top-down approach where designers of technology design something and give to a community to solve specific problems, or this idea of technology transfer, and even when they have the input of the community, they're kind of working with people who kind of had the training to do that, have some ideas that come from outside. But I think we have a lot to learn of looking at these examples from bottom up, ground up, and grassroots examples of how communities organize among themselves that led to creative solutions. And that could be used, for example, to help other communities who haven't developed some of this, or populations of these practices. So instead of coming from the top down, understanding that from the bottom up. And that can definitely influence policy or technology design in ways that we actually interact with and understand what creative practices can be. And another finding that we hope that's going to have an impact on the way we understand creativity is also kind of learning that you don't have to reserve time to be creative or learn from a book how to be creative, or that creativity is not an inherent DNA trace that people have, but it's actually something that emerges from community connections and networks among people's technologies and their mobility or immobility practices. Specifically looking into the power relationships that kind of propel this kind of creativity. We all knew that, for example, Google had that initiative of 80-20, in which you would work 80% Google's projects and then 20% on your own project, like the employees. And that was a way to try to force creativity to happen on free time. But sometimes, even if you don't have time to allocate for creativity, that's when the most amazing and unexpected solutions happen. So just in conclusion, I think one of our main contributions is actually to understand, to kind of reframe how we understand creativity, and also include practices that were previously not considered creative as also creativity. And we believe that this is pretty important. I mean, obviously there are other names sometimes, as I mentioned, for these practices, like appropriation or subversion, but creativity has normally been connected to high arts and to a positive outcome. And obviously there are times when this kind of creativity can go really bad, but we are trying to look at how people in situations of marginalized communities, in situations of hardship, they can improve their lives through out-of-the-box and unexpected solutions, and kind of recognize those practices as well. So we hope that can help not only kind of change how scholars think about our relationship between technology, people, and spaces, and the importance actually of connecting these things with the mobility and the lack of mobility, and also how designers of technology think about interacting with communities or governments in terms of technology transfer, or understanding how to help people who are in a situation of hardships. And if you want to contribute to our project, we do have online repository that we're really hoping that people from all over the world can add examples of mobile network creativity, because the more examples and cases we have, the better we will be able to define this idea and share what's been going on with different communities and scholars as well.